All right, let's cross now to Western Australia, to the town of Nannup, a farming and timber milling community a couple of 100 kilometres south of Perth. Joining me now, former Prime Minister, my former boss too, Tony Abbott, Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor, Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie. Gentlemen, thank you. Well, thank you for getting off your bikes, firstly, and for joining me tonight. We'll get to the reason why you've been riding for charity a little bit later. But Tony Abbott, if I can start with you, I need your reaction, please, to what we've seen play out in Israel over the weekend, but more particularly, the fallout on the streets of Sydney and things now happening in Melbourne too, where anti-Jew protesters have caused such mayhem.
Well, as for the events in Israel, Peter, it was a vicious attack on democracy, a vicious attack on civilians that should be universally condemned. As for what we saw in Sydney, frankly, it was absolutely un-Australian, and people who come to live in this country really must leave ancient hatreds behind. Final point I want to make is that the police have got to be far tougher on this kind of thing. Any protest that is likely to involve massive race hate, as this one did, should be dispersed. I mean, the police were more than capable of breaking up anti-lockdown protests, if necessary, with rubber bullets and tear gas. Why weren't they prepared to disperse this protest with the same kind of vigour? Our streets must be owned by the police and by our citizens, not by violent, hate-filled protesters.
Andrew, as someone who's worn a uniform to fight against terrorism overseas, what do you make of comments from Greens politicians, sporting stars, and I think weak responses from some Labor frontbenchers too, that basically have this moral equivalency between Hamas and Ukrainian freedom fighters?
I think it's terrible, Peter. I think this isn't a time for silence. It's not a time for equivocation. It's very clear what happened in Israel over the weekend was murder. The slaughter of the elderly, the slaughter of women and children, the rape of women. Any person in the right mind should be able to condemn that. I condemn it. I stand with Israel. And I think what we've seen on the Labor front bench particularly is troubling, that they've been so mealy-mouthed about something that's so clear. It's an act of evil and should be condemned as such.
Angus, the Prime Minister has criticised the coalition, says you're playing politics with this issue. He, of course, has been around the country on The Voice. He's not had any events or been in contact with the Jewish community. He has, this afternoon, though, visited a synagogue. John Howard has said that the government is pussyfooting around here. Peter Dutton says if there's anyone in that crowd on Monday night that isn't an Australian citizen, cancel their visa and send them home. Why do you think the government has been slow in its response?
Well, that's a very good question, Peter, because this was an evil and malicious terrorist attack. And the truth is that as far as we know, the government hasn't even had a National Security Committee meeting to deal with it. Now, whenever we see a significant event, particularly a terrorist attack like this, that has implications for Australia, and this clearly does, even just looking at the protests in recent days, you would expect a government to have a meeting of the National Security Committee and to work through how to make sure we get the right response to this. We are not seeing that from this government, and I think there are some very, very serious questions that Anthony Albanese needs to answer.